And welcome to the second day of the Newcastle Poetry Festival. For those of you who were there last night at Jory Graham's riveting opening reading, welcome back. For those of you who have just arrived this morning, you're very welcome to this, the second day of our festival, which goes on until Saturday. And I'm not the main host at all, but I just wanted to say a few words of greeting and let you know about a couple of other things that are happening. So today we are delighted to be hosting the second annual Northern Poetry Symposium. This time the focus is entirely on translation and migration. In partnership with the Poetry Book Society and PoetTrio, an AHRC-funded research project on poetry translation at Newcastle University. Many thanks to the Poetry Book Society and PoetTrio for organising such a fantastic showcase today. There are a few other things happening. So today, later on, in Sage Gateshead, Free Forums is kicking off at 8 o'clock in stage 2. We'll be hearing long-awaited UK premiere of the Latino Grammy-nominated performance of Jugar con Fuego, Playing with Fire, a collaboration between poet Fernando Valverde and singer Juan Pinilla and guitarist David Carroll, followed by Pulitzer-winning poet Tyhimba Jess, who's come all the way from Brooklyn. He arrived late yesterday, and he's going to be doing a poetry jazz collaboration with Binker and Moses. They're coming up from London this morning, and this is the first time Tyhimba Jess has ever read in the UK, and the first time this collaboration has ever happened. There are still tickets available for Free Forums tonight at 8 o'clock. Workshops have been threaded throughout the festival. 2 happened yesterday, 2 happened very early this morning, and there are 2 more. Places are available for Tyhimba Jess's workshop on Saturday morning, and that's looking at the connections between poetry and music, particularly music of the African American tradition, and you can book places for that on the NCLA website. There has never been a more apposite socio-political moment in which to deeply consider the act of translating poetry. The spirit of crossing over, of giving voice to, at the very heart of poetry translation, has animated all our thinking and programming for the Newcastle Poetry Festival this year. Without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over now to Rebecca Johnson from the translation project PoetTrio, who will be your guide for today's proceedings.
Good morning and welcome everyone to today. I'm delighted that you're all here. It's been a real joy putting this programme together with the Poetry Book Society and the Newcastle Centre for Literary Arts. We were sort of overwhelmed by the riches of this theme. There seemed so many possibilities in poetry translation, and we hope you enjoy today. Our chair for the first panel is the poet W.N. Herbert. Bill, as we call him, is Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle. He's a prize-winning and much anthologised poet. He's Makar, aka a town poet of Dundee, his hometown, and editor of major volumes of Chinese poetry in translation published by Blood Axe, among many other brilliant projects. Bill is also a co-investigator and colleague on the PoetTrio translation project, on which I'm a researcher. Bill will lead this first discussion in which panellists reflect on the collaborative processes involved in poetry translation. They'll draw out the complexities and observations about how they collaborate with poets to translate work, drawing on their own experience and scholarship as well. Joining Bill on the panel, we have Carolyn Leeder at the end here, who is Professor of German at New College, Oxford. Karen is a prolific and prize-winning translator of emerging and established German poets, such as Evelyn Schlaug, Rel Schrott, Durs Grünbein, and Karen's also recent winner of the English Pen Award and American Pen Heim Award for her recent translation of Ulrike Ahmed-Sandich. The new book, Thick of It, is just out with Seagull Books. Carolyn Forche here is a celebrated and widely published American poet, translator and activist born in Detroit, Michigan. Her translations of Claribel Alegría, Gail Trapo, Robert Desnos and Mahmoud Daesh have won great critical acclaim. As a poet, Forche's recent collection, In the Lateness of the World, was a finalist for the Neustadt International Prize for Literature. And Carolyn is here at the festival today with her collaborator, the Swedish poet Lars Gustaff Andersson. Since his debut collection in 1986, Swedish poet Lars Gustaff Andersson has published 6 volumes of poetry. He is Professor of Literature and Film at the University of Lund, where he is currently research leader on the project Between the Lines, Poetry as Knowledge, which asks questions such as, can poetical work function as a learning process? Can poetry qualify as knowledge? Some of these questions may be answered today, who knows? And finally, we have Professor Francis Jones. Francis is the principal investigator on the PoetTrio project. He's Professor of Translation at Newcastle University and is a prize-winning translator with over 15 volumes published. Francis translates from Dutch and Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, and he's also translated from German, Hungarian, Russian, and Caribbean Creoles. Besides translating to Standard English, Francis has also translated into Northern English dialects, and I can attest to the brilliance of those translations. I've read them, they're great. Anyway, over to you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Welcome, good morning everyone to this first panel of what looks to be an absolutely fascinating day. I'm honoured to be sitting here with such distinguished translators, and I'm very grateful to the NCLA and to Newcastle University, PoetTrio Society, etc. for setting up this marvellous event. I'm here strictly in the form of an enthusiastic amateur and slightly better than vagrant in the field of translation, in that it's become an obsession of mine over the last 10 years. And without possessing languages, I'm nonetheless fascinated by them, by how they interact, and by particularly what it is that we do when we translate. So the focus of this morning's first panel is on this collaborative act, the nature of the relationship variously between the source poet, the translator as language expert, and the translator as target poet, not necessarily language expert. So all of the strategies, all of the collaborative processes, all of the society that they attempt to create. This fascinates me, and that's almost all I'm going to say all morning now, because what I really want to do is get them to tell us about it. So I'm going to take that traditional first step in panels of simply asking people what they are doing. And some will give you a little bit more of elaboration, some will give you actual samples and bits of their work, and with some it will be a very loaded question, because in the case of Francis, I know exactly what he's doing. We've been working on it for the past more than a year. It is a collaborative translation project with a number of Dutch poets. The distinguished Dutch poets are with us this morning. And so I will adopt a kind of faux naive air and say, Francis, what is it that you're doing at the moment?
Well, let me tell you about the main thing I'm involved with at the moment. I'm sure I'm also translating myself on the quiet. Yes, the PoetTrio project is it's really a research. It's both a research and just a poetry project, in that we're collaboratively translating between 3 UK poets, Fiona Sampson, Sean O'Brien, and Bill Herbert. 3 Dutch poets, Emma von Haren, Helen Gelens, and Menno Wigma, who sadly passed away a few months ago. Now, the idea is, in a poet trio, that we have 2 poets with 2 different languages and a key intermediary who We called the intermediary the language advisor, but it's very hard to know, to think of a good name for them. The bilingual translator, then everybody's translators. The language advisor, their job is to mediate between the languages, explain meanings of words, explain cultural references, to also, quite simply as well, interpret, say, Dutch dialogue into English, or English words into Dutch, and generally referee that, the business. And yes, we had 2 workshops last year, one at Poetry International Rotterdam, the Poetry International Festival, where the UK poets' work was translated into Dutch, and then a follow-up workshop in July last year at Newcastle University, where we went from Dutch into English. It was a sort of speed dating in a way that we had these trios, 3 different trios in 3 different rooms, because we had 3 different UK poets, 3 different Dutch poets, and so on. But every day that say the Dutch poet would go to another room, so that by the end of the week, every Dutch poet had worked with every UK poet. And yes, we'll be reading. There'll be readings. We've had readings of the translations and the source poems, and there'll be a follow-up reading about that later today.
Thanks, Francis. That's all news to me, and we will go more deeply into some of the issues that are raised by that particular trio, the dynamic of that trio, the kind of the different skill sets that are being brought into the space of translation, which are traditionally concentrated in the figure of the translator, but become diversified in that trio, and of course that comes with all sorts of power relations and assumptions, which we can interrogate further. But at this point, less interrogation and more elucidation. Carolyn, what are you up to lately?
Well, I'm trying to embody all those roles, more or less unsuccessfully. I'm working at the moment on a number of with a number of German poets. I'm an academic by trade, so it means that I have a rather privileged relationship with translation, in that I only translate people that I'm interested in and like and want to translate, and don't need to sort of earn my livelihood like that, which I think is important actually in terms of what one gets to do. And I also work often on the writers that I'm translating. And I do think of translation as a really privileged first reading, critical reading in a way, in that one gets very close up against the text and has to really understand it. And of course there's research to understand what's going on in the background and what to talk to the author, but then also there's a stage of simultaneously letting go and engaging with the language itself. And so it's a sort of strange 2 parts of the brain, I think, are activated simultaneously, or at least one after the other. I'm working, at the moment, I've just brought out a book by Evelyn Schlag, who was due to be here for this festival, but unfortunately can't be here. That's just come out, and we're still working actually on a couple of new poems for various festivals. I have a very close relationship with her. She speaks good English, and she also translates from English. She's done a wonderful edition of Douglas Dunn into Austrian German, and so it's very alive to the nuances of English. So it's a very particular, quite a close working relationship, which is generally about emails and drafts, but also about intense moments working together. I'm also working with Doris Grunbein, who is more absent in that regard, also has good English, but as many translators will know, he says things like, don't worry about the images, don't worry about the rhymes, don't worry about the rhythms, just make it sing. Until you show him a draft, and then he says, what about that image? What about that rhyme? I'm also working with two other poets at the moment, a young German writer who's been mentioned, Ulrike Alexander, who works with poetry and film, poetry and music particularly, and that's a new challenge, writing translations which will also fit with the various rock bands and that she collaborates with. And Michael Krüger, a sort of grand old man of German letters, who I'm on my sort of third outing with him, and he's the most hands-off of all, I think. With that experience comes the will to let his translations go into the world on their own and stand or fall. So very different experiences with all of those people, which I will pick up in a second.
Well, I'm quite interested in this idea of greater or less absence. All of your authors are living. So,
I've translated a number of dead authors too, and they're very easy. But yes, I enjoy the challenge of working, the challenge and the fun of working closely with someone.
or the extreme absence of the dead. But the more pertinent and intimate absence is the fact that even Schlag can't be with us today. I'm wondering if you can represent her voice in some way. Would you like to look out and read something?
Yes,
a little
Fine.
flavour? Yes? How about now?
Okay, it's a good job I've got the book. It's the first time I've seen the book actually. So, would you like it in German? That's the question.
I think it's, generally we would like to hear the both. Yes, that would be very nice. Thank you.
Unbewaffneter ziviler Sicherheitsdienst. Die Überwachungskamera läuft Zeugnis ab von kleinen Stadthyänen oder soll man sagen, die Gewaltbereitschaft ist Produkt. Ein Mädchen um die 15 springt und greift sich eine Feindin, zerrt und tritt sie, als sie schon am Boden liegt, 6-mal. Bei dieser Haltestelle kracht es öfter. Gelbe Jacken voll Security umrunden tatenlos die Zähne. Er vertragt, verbietet jede Art von Eingriff. Schnelle Gangmitglieder bücken sich nach iPod, Handy, Tasche, Collateral, Gewinn. Das Opfer ist bestimmt kein Herzchen. Niemand ist ein Herzchen. Vielleicht das kleinste Mädchen mit der rosa Jacke, das auf den getretenen Kopf hinunterschaut und endlich wegläuft. Schülerrucksack auf und ab. Sorry, I'm finding my way around a new collection. The CCTV camera bears witness to the little town hyenas, or perhaps this willingness to commit violence is the product. A girl of about 15 strikes and grapples with a rival, pulls and kicks her 6 times as she's already crumpled on the deck. There's often trouble at this stop. Yellow jackets full of security surround the scene, stand by. Their contracts forbid any kind of intervention. Gang members quickly duck and pick up iPod, mobile, handbag, collateral gains. For sure, the victim is no sweetheart. No one is a sweetheart. Perhaps the littlest girl with the silver jacket, who stands looking at the kicked-in skull, then skips away, her school bag bobbing up and down.
Thank you.
Astute listeners will have noticed that a pink anorak turns silver in the English. We can talk about that later.
Yes. I'm afraid, as a kind of simple musical dog in relation to German, I only heard by name iPod in the course of it. So that small detail we will indeed go on to. Yes, absolutely. We do have both parts of another fascinating partnership here, Lars and Carolyn, and I wonder if I can turn to Lars and ask him if he would talk a little bit about your work.
I think in this illustrious panel, I'm the true amateur. I have worked with poetry all my life, but done very few translations until recently, when Carolyn Forche involved me in a project concerning 3 poets. And the first poet, which we will talk about, is Lasse Söderberg, a Swedish poet and translator born in the 1930s, in the same generation as Thomas Tranströmer, and actually a friend of him. And he has been an extremely important translator himself, especially from Spanish and French. And he is still active as a translator. I read my Swedish morning paper this morning, and saw a review of his latest translation from Dutch, the Leonard Nolans book, which was published the other day. And he's also a very interesting poet and very productive. But both Carolyn and I know him, and we met, the 3 of us met at a poetry festival last year. And Carolyn was fascinating that his work is not available in English. It is available in Spanish. He is well published in even both in Spain and in Latin America, in Mexico and Colombia, but not in English, almost not at all. And you were quite disturbed by that fact. So we started to collaborate on work where we will do kind of the selected poems, the selected poetry of Söderberg. And we will tell you how we do that. But then we also we have 2 other poets, and that is Carolyn Forche and Lars Gustaff Andersson. And I have translated some of Carolyn's poems in connection to a poetry festival in Sweden, where I made the Swedish translations of some of her poems, and she has made translations of my poem, which you will have the pleasure to listen to, at least the English versions you will have the pleasure of in this afternoon. We'll have a reading together. And I don't know if this is a fair description, Carolyn, but we are, when it comes to describe how we work with Lasse Söderberg's poems, since Carolyn knows a lot of languages, but she's not speaking Swedish. But she has admirable talent to learn fast, and I think you read now pretty good. But I make some kind of rough translation into what I think is English, and then Carolyn looks at it and makes something else. And we of course we discuss and try to balance sound and semantics in there. And I think my contribution is maybe to give context, and the cultural context, and what there is hidden in as allusions to other Swedish poets, which of course is impossible for Carolyn to find. And then she makes it sing, I think.
Thank you. I would like to add to that about the disturbance that I felt in realizing that Lasse Söderberg was not in English. The first time I encountered a major poet who was not in English was when I was very young, was Claribel Alegria. She had been translated into many world languages, but not English. And I had never translated before and thought it was a matter of buying the fattest dictionary I could find. I had studied, fortunately, Spanish in college, but my difficulty there was not with the language as much as it was with my inability to distinguish literal from figurative language in Claribel's work because of the context of her work. She wrote out of political extremity, which I myself had not experienced. So my first collaboration was with her. I went to Spain and stayed with her, and she told me many, many, many stories which opened me to the realities of Latin America in the decades just preceding my time there, which was in the late 70s. So I view translation always as a collaboration, and for me there's always been a bit of synchronicity and magic about who I wind up translating. I met Lasse Soderberg in Bogota, where we were both attending a festival, and his partner, Angela, who is from Bogota, and now lives with Lasse in Sweden, invited me to Malmo the following year, and that is how I met Lars, and then we all began working together. So I want to say that I'm from the United States, and a very small percentage of publishing in the United States is dedicated to the publishing of literary works at all. And of those small number of literary works, both in prose and in poetry, only 3% are translations from other languages. So I'm from a very xenophobic country, and a country that because of that xenophobia is now in serious trouble. I won't elaborate, you know how much trouble we're in, and some of that comes from our ignorance of the rest of the world. So for me, working in the work of translation is itself a kind of work against that xenophobia. It has a moral dimension for me, and a political dimension, I would say. So I'm an amateur in all languages, even English, but I claim English as my language, but I think that we as translators always feel a bit provisional, and we always are in collaboration, and we always need help. I have translated from languages I'm somewhat familiar with, and I've also translated from languages I know nothing about, a bit in the trio method, and then I'm now learning a language by translating it, which is the third way, which is the Swedish experience.
Thank you both. It's an interesting point. This sense of the kind of charmed zone that we have to enter into in some way to translate, where coincidence plays its part, luck has its role, and also moral conviction. It draws us to each other. But there is a tremendous gulf to cross in all of these areas. We talked about making it sing. I think we probably need to go a little bit further into what we mean by singing in this context. I've translated from several languages that I know nothing about, and some of them I know even less about than others. And the Chinese poet Yang Lian, who I've worked with, and Fiona Sampson, the co-investigator on this project, has also worked with, has a kind of almost Walter Benjamin type attitude of what he calls the universal mother tongue of poetry, that there is something underlying everything that we try to do as poets, which makes us uniquely interested in each other. Now that comes with all sorts of assumptions, not least the word mother. So it seems to me that that there is a great deal of idealism and faith in these ideas, and it might be worth pooling them apart a little bit to see how it actually works. So I will revert to my colleague on the left here, and absolutely, if you can tell us a little bit about your experience of the dynamics of this space that is created, this poet trio space. And of course, you're in the position to be able to contrast it with your solo work and how you approach the act of translation.
I think firstly, poetry translators are fairly few on the ground, so opening it up to a poetry type of translation simply enables more translation. But to my mind, it's more than that, because we're actually pooling specific expertises. I mean, I'm a poetry translator, I'm not a poet, But in short, I do my best. But essentially, I'm a linguist by training. But in the Poet Trio, we've got the expertises of poets who simply know how to write poetry, and we've got the expertise of linguists who translate between Dutch and English in this case, and who know about poetry. Plus the fact that we've got the source poet there as a crucial informant. Now, there is a school of thought which says that you shouldn't have the text is the only thing, and you should only deal with the text, and any additional information that the source poet, the source writer brings is irrelevant to the text. I simply know as a translator, you need to know why, how, where did this poem come from? Even if you're getting that information, right, so that's what the poem's on about. Okay, I'm going to choose some solutions, and then we're going to hide the fact. We're going to hide that privileged information, and it means that the poem makes sense. And then that I think is absolutely crucial in having the source poet there. But there's also a fascinating three-way interplay, the communication mediated by the language advisor, the intermediary translator. There's also, I guess, a sort of a spoken agreement beforehand, which is that the final responsibility for how for what the poem's going to sound like rests with the target poet, but it's still a very collaborative process. And so, say in some trios, we might see the language advisor and the poet actually virtually co-translating, whereas in other trios, the language advisor might be there ready on hand to throw in, to be asked about solutions, to say, oh, wait a minute, literally it means this. And if say the target poet and the source poet are wandering off in a certain direction, but not saying, well, you should be literal. So there are all sorts of different styles of interaction. But for myself as essentially a solo translator who's worked with poets, it's fascinating to observe, and actually fascinating to take part in as well as a language advisor.
I think one of my main experiences of it is a sense of going beyond. That it is a shared space, a collaborative space, but it is one in which you cannot rest on your laurels. You cannot be comfortable in your expertise if you are to translate. And so I found in the Poet Trio that each person had to go beyond what their particular poetic style or engagement was, or their sense of themselves as possessing an expertise. And the most successful translations seem to come from a space that opened up between these three areas of very highly talented, very skilled people. But it was when each of them went beyond themselves that they met in something which approximates. I think, Carolyn, you said it was a very the translation is one of the most intense ways of reading. And I think that these other ways of reading, which we touch upon every now and then. Last night we heard that particular thing, which is recitation, the not reading silently. This is one intense form of reading, and we receive it differently from the silence of the page. But translation is one of the most transforming of those modes. and in a sense the translation experience, the thing that the greedy poet, with even myself with no knowledge of other languages, I think we're all pitting our inexperience against each other here to find out who is the least qualified person to talk about this thing that we are most passionately involved in. It fascinates me, the passion, and it is that curiosity. There's something that's fed in the writer by going into this space, and I think I believe also fed by feeds the translator. But this is a space in which everything which is culturally fixed becomes relative. So I wonder, Carolyn, if I can ask you about the relative cultural weight when you're translating of the different issues which approach you in one language and how you have to find a way of meeting them in another.
Sure, but let me just say something about that magic, because I started talking about research, and that, in fact, I believe in the magic aspect of it. I interviewed Don Patterson recently, talking about his translations of Rilke, and he had a really brilliant image, I thought, which is that when you translate somebody, you create pathways in your brain that allow you to say things that you aren't able to say in your own voice. But that, interestingly, when you finish translating that person, then the pathways remain. So it takes you beyond yourself. And I had this experience very powerfully with the book of Evelyn's poems. And when I looked at it, I couldn't remember that I'd written some of those translations. They seemed in an English that was so strange to me and so foreign from what I'd say that there was something extra beyond myself. I really liked that idea that you mentioned. But also, there were lots of, I discovered for the first time, despite having taught German for over 30 years, that, for example, German language and English language poets scan differently. I would have thought I would have noticed that by now, but it's very interesting. The most intense and combative discussions that Evelyn and I had translating were about how one would represent rhythm. And she is a very rhythmic poet, especially in recent collections. No rhyme, no punctuation, but very precise rhythms. But I noticed that Germans, for example, in a 5-beat line, can insert any number of unstressed syllables, which to an English ear just doesn't work, it seems to me. So we very often had long arguments about, can we put a the in there? No, absolutely not, it breaks the rhythm. And both of us thought that we knew quite a lot about rhythm. So I realised that actually something as fundamental as rhythm works very differently in different languages. And I mentioned the lack of punctuation, and also Evelyn has started writing with a lack of capital letters, which are part of grammar in German. Nouns have capital letters. And this allows a great fluidity in her writing, so that a word can often stand between a vowel, a noun, and an adjective, and a verb, and you don't know what it is. And of course, recreating that in English is quite a challenge. But when I came to, but I followed that lack of punctuation and that lack of uppercase for a long time in my drafts. But then when I looked at them, I realised that actually the grammar of German is a much more scaffolding grammar than English. So you have very clear delineations. You can tell how one clause relates to another in a way that you can't in English. And so the poetry seemed more abandoned, more loose, free-floating, perhaps too exposed like that in English. And it also allied it with positions in particularly feminist poetry, which Evelyn didn't share. So in the end, rather sadly, I made the decision to put in some capital letters and punctuation. I'm still not sure, but I think there's an anchor there. And so even at that basic level, I mean, we could talk a lot about cultural transfer, but even at that basic level of how you hear rhythm and what a kind of grammatical choice means in one language and in another is so relative because it rests on different traditions and different ways of reading.
I had a very clear example of that in my own translating experience. I was translating from Somali poetry, where the predominant metre is quantitative, it's not stress-based, and the main poetic device is alliteration. So this is an oral poetry in which the principal thing that happens is a single alliterating sound. It goes not just through a line, but through a poem. And poems can be quite long. They can be several hundred lines, as we think, a bit long, going on one alliterative sound. This is a very good instance of relative cultural weight. If we do this in English, it feels like you're beating the listener about the head with a wooden block, because we associate alliteration in our present era with the language of headlines, and we have a vague memory of the Anglo-Saxon and Middle English basis of alliteration. But we've inherited the use of rhyme in such a powerful way that we actually have to come up with a different strategy to get something of the same effect. I think this is a point that Carolyn wanted to come in on.
I was interested in Karen's remarks about opening new paths in the brain, because I think it was Ilya Kaminsky, who's in the audience now, who also has done a great deal of translation, who said to me once, we're not only translating poets into English, we're translating English into the poets, and we're expanding the possibilities of English. But I want to say one little thing about this experience for the poet translating. It feels a bit like you have to become the poet you are translating, and you have to enter their sensibility somehow. And there's a kind of secret in the poem that is at the core of the poem, is where the poem originated, in the sensibility of the poet. There was the late Daniel Simcoe, who translated the early 20th century Austrian poet Georg Trakl. And he was staying with me in France while he was doing it, and he came home one night and he was in a very dark mood, and he said, my problem is I am becoming Trakl. So he became Trakl for about a year, and then he got himself back when the volume was finished. And I have had this experience. It's very interesting. And I don't think you get all the way through the thicket of the translation process without somehow allowing that person into your own subjective consciousness.
But you need your escape route at the end. I think that's very
You have to find a way back to yourself.
Would it be possible to hear something now, Caroline? Just to bring that back into focus for us, centered on the poem.
Yeah, I will read a poem by this Lasse Söderberg, whom you may never have heard of before, but from one of his later collections, and it's a poem called, in English it's called, we call it Cities, and in Swedish it sounds like this: Städer. Alla mina städer var inbillade, städer i huvudet, huvudstäder. Inte olika drömmar som man vaknar från och sen försöker minnas i detalj. Alla mina städer var inbillade. Jag strövade på deras gator, ledsagad av vålnader som överrumplande trädde fram ur portgångar till husen där de hade bott. Eller där jag själv hade varit inhyst någon gång, kanske för länge sedan. Och jag förde inbillade samtal fulla av namn och årtal med dessa töckengestalter som jag kunde vara säker på dök upp om staden bara var inbillad nog. Eller var det vänner i sinnevärlden som ännu mötte mig i dessa stenoaser som bestod av idéer mer än sten och vilkas inbillade förflutna jag delade. Sannoliken städer. Att gå vilse i dem och att hitta sig själv eller delar av sig själv som man glömt eller varit ovetande om. Gator som gick i olika riktningar, blomstertorg och ödetomter, verklighet förvandlad till inbildning. Alla mina städer fanns och fortsätter att finnas fjärran i mig med byggnader känsliga som ögonlock. Det är i dem jag lever. Now you again. English.
Cities. All my cities were imaginary. Cities in the mind. Capital cities. Not different from dreams that you wake from and try to remember. All my cities were imaginary. I walked on their streets accompanied by ghosts that suddenly appeared in the doorways to the houses where they had lived, or where I myself had been living some time, maybe long ago, and I had imaginary conversations full of names and years with these fog beings that I could be certain would appear if only the city were imaginary enough. Or were they friends in the real world who still met me in those oases of stone, which were made of ideas more than stone and whose imaginary past I shared? Truly cities, to be lost in them, was to find yourself or parts of yourself that you had forgotten or been unaware of. Streets that went in different directions, flower markets and empty lots, reality transformed into imagination. All my cities were, and continue to be, far away within me, with buildings sensitive as eyelids. It is in these that I live.
Time is winging swiftly on even as we speak, and I would like at this point to open the panel to questions from the floor, and I call upon the roving mic of Captain David Spittle, if you could. And if you pop your hands in the air, I see one hand. I can't see back actually. Ah, there we go. Okay, so perhaps Dave, start on the aisle here, and then the other hand that was up there. Okay, good.
I was really interested in the point that in this lovely relationship between the translator and the poet, there is a combative element. So I suppose I'm looking for gossip without names. Don Patterson, in his wonderful versions of Machado, said for him the version was like walking along the road with the poet. So can you give me an image, a better image than that for what it is for you, or can you give me some gossip where it didn't work? I mean, the way a playwright says the relationship with the author broke down. I don't want any names, but is there anything that's happened to you which has stopped the translation process?
Well, I could come up with a quick one, but I'll hand over to others. The kind of the nature of the interlinear, the text which is presented in my translation context, can be terribly fraught because it is not a neutral space. It is not a neutral text. It is something that someone has invested a great deal of time and energy in, and it is already an interpretive text. And indeed, poets like Ted Hughes famously found the interlinear full of pretty much all the poetry they needed and almost focused on that. And one instance with a Turkish poet who shall remain nameless, and his translator who shall remain, I think, lost to time forever, hopefully. Were terrible arguments with the guy who had provided this translator who provided this interlinear, who would not budge on any detail in it. Again, you end up in that space where you cannot not lay claim to or ownership of this text, but you simply cannot put it forward to be published. You understand that it's not made the transition; it is stuck in its accuracy. Only to talk to the poet later and find that he had no such idea, not the slightest notion that any of these were the absolute immovable points beyond which his work could not go, and that it was entirely down to the translator who felt that these were lines in the sand which could not be crossed. So that's very much to do with, I said earlier, the power, role, and the sense of ownership of the text concerned, but perhaps my colleagues can point to
Well,
another
I do have
more
an
cheerful incident.
I do have a cheerful image actually, which is that one of the poets, Ulrike Andersson, had a dream about me. Obviously, talk about entering the heads of the translator enters the heads of the poet. And I was a jolly bus driver who drove her across the sea. So think of your translator as a jolly bus driver. But I think I have also acted for British poets, who I won't name, who have done versions of German poets, and that's quite tricky. I really hats off to people who serve as the intermediary, because translation means a lack of ego, but doing that really means a lack of ego, as I've watched the beautiful phrases that I've found taken up into the poem and then no acknowledgement whatsoever. So it's quite a tough, I think that kind of ferrying across is a very particular thing that takes a very particular sensitivity and egoless, multiple sensitivity to be able to do it. I don't have that.
But Carolyn, perhaps?
Well, you do have to give yourself over to the poet you're translating. There is a significant American translator who's also a poet who will remain unnamed, but he translates mostly poets from Spanish, from Latin America, but he's also translated from Swedish. And the thing, when I first read the poets in Swedish, I read his translations. And Tranströmer, Ekelöf, the Swedish poet, they all sounded like Spanish surrealists, and it was really wonderful. But it wasn't until much later that I learned that the Swedes were not ecstatics, were not Spanish surrealists. So he made something nice, but it had very little to do with poets he was translating. You can see why I'm not naming him, but there are clues in what I said.
Will that do for the gossip end of your question? The other one was Jessica over here.
This is a question for Carolyn in particular, but for everyone. I was interested that you said you met this Swedish poet, but you didn't know Swedish, so I was wondering how you recognised that this was a poet that should be translated.
It was a slow process. I first got to know them, and I was invited to come to the Malmö Festival to read my own work. And the more I learned about Lasse, the more I realized that, that there was an injustice there, that he had not been translated into English, and he should have been. And so I'm kind of attracted to situations like that. And so I decided I had to do something about it. And over time, as I got to know Lars, I realized that I could do it because I had a partner who knew Spanish and I could make an English poem of what we did. So we started this collaboration. So when I first started, I didn't know anything about Lasse's poetry. I just knew that he was important in his own country, in his own language, and my country was ignorant of his work. So it was just that impulse, and that started. And then as I got involved with it, then I started to fall in love with Lasse's poetry. So, that's how it happened. And Lasse taught me a little bit to read in Swedish. And Ilya Kaminsky, when he came from Ukraine to the United States, in Rochester, New York, it was too late to get into the English class, and you told me he started learning English by translating 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens. So if he could do that, I realized I could learn Swedish by translating Lasse.
Lovely. I think one of the most selfless translators I know is Francis Jones. Would you like to say a few words about what it is that pulls you into that space and makes you translate an author over another?
I think I very much echo what Carolyn says, that there's you experience a writer and think, this person really should speak in my language too, and yeah, so it's the sort of thing that you think, well, yeah, it's worth spending a couple of years of my time or more doing that, just because of the sheer excitement of the new that you've experienced. I think there's also an intellectual excitement, or maybe it's an emotional excitement, I don't know, of writing yourself into a poet's voice. Now, imagine that this poet was writing in English. I'm sure it's totally impossible. So, I don't know, a Bosnian poet who's lived through the Second World War, or whatever, you can't. But in the sense that it can be wonderful just developing totally different voices for totally different poets that you're translating. And I think this emotional involvement is really important as well.
I think that's true, and Paul Muldoon talked about how a translation can go back to the sort of poem that inspired a poem in its original language. And I think there is a sense in which translations, if you give yourself over to them, can discover something that was at the origin of the original poem, but which perhaps is only a trace in it now, and fetch it out. So there can be, if you really give yourself over to it, and there can be all kinds of discoveries there. It's quite a humble, you have to be able to be humble, really, to find those things.
It's a strangely, it's curiosity. Poets are among the most curious creatures after cats on the planet, and there's a strange selfishness in it. It is a very strange selfishness, because what you want is to be changed. You want yourself to be changed, your practice to be changed, to develop and to become something more. So it is a strange but marvellous selfishness. We're just reaching the point where the organisers begin to look nervously at their watches and think, when will he stop? So I will stop, and I will just say that the PoetTrio event, this is a marvellous day full of many events and panels. The PoetTrio event itself is on at 12:15, and you can hear more of the translation processes of our colleagues on the panel tonight at 5:15 in the symposium showcase, where I believe drink is involved. And there is one other thing I should mention, which is another aspect of the PoetTrio process, was an arts commission where we asked Martin Heslop, the composer, to produce a new work for us based on translation, and that will be launched at 4:30. So do come to all of that, and indeed everything else, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy the rest of the day, and indeed the festival. But can I ask you now, if you wouldn't mind thanking the panel in the order of Lars, Gustaff, Andersson, Carolyn, Forche, whoever I am, Francis Jones, and indeed Karen.